Hello, everyone. Andrea, thank you for your testimony. That was powerful. Glory to God for that. And, testimonies, to testify about God's glory in our lives. So I was honored to be asked to share the testimony here with you guys today. So I was born in Colombia, South America. I lived there for the first 13 years of my life. And so I technically grew up in what we call social Catholicism. So you're a Catholic or a Christian, but you don't really practice a spiritual walk or relationship with Christ. I remember when I was little, I used to go to church with my grandma. And the most exciting thing about that was that afterwards we would stop at a shop and eat empanadas and buñuelos. So then I would always say, okay, so today is empanada day, buñuelo day. But, and we would enjoy that. They were a good time with my grandma. But again, there wasn't a particular spiritual component to my trips to church. I know for my grandma it was, but it wasn't for me. And so growing up in Colombia, I grew up in a single parent household. And there wasn't a lot of guidance, a lot of I think support or a certainty about things for those first 10 years it was okay, but the last 3 years that I lived in Colombia, we moved around a lot. We went to different cities, and eventually my mom met an American person. They got married, and we essentially came to the States when I was 13 because after they had met and dated for a while, he essentially chose to bring us. So my mom sold everything. We left all our family, friends, possessions, and came to the States, which was exciting, of course, going to the U.S. It was scary and uncertain. Within that first year, of course, we were just getting to know the culture, the language, everything was new. And unfortunately, within the last year, my mom started to experience some abuse in the relationship. So it became clear to us that we were not going to be staying in this situation for very long. And because of those specifics of the abuse, at some point we had to involve the authorities so we could leave the house. And the main reason for that is because, as I just mentioned, we left everything in Colombia. So we had nothing to go back to, and we were here with what they call a fiancé visa. So you are only legally in the States as long as you're within the confines of that relationship, that marriage. So then if you're asking authorities to help you leave the house, leave the relationship, then there are some legal issues and many people end up being deported. So we called the police or the authorities to make sure everything is in order. And so after being in this home for 6 to 12 months, we find ourselves in a shelter by the government, essentially a shelter for battered women, to make sure everything was done legally properly. And so we find ourselves in a shelter, with probably a book bag, a pair of shorts, a t-shirt, and probably a bag of corn chips, because I love corn chips, And so there is a lot of uncertainty during this time. And it is at this time that we meet two people that are important in my spiritual journey. One of the people, her name is Maritza, which she's from Colombia, and she met my mom at a job. And she actually was the one that invited us to a Protestant church. It was in a Nazarene church, and this was foreign to us. And then the second person that we met, her name is Sheila. She's an African-American woman from the States, and she ended up being a spiritual mentor of mine. Well, when we're in the shelter, there's a lot of changes, a lot of new things, and Maritza, my mom's friend, invited us to her church, the Nazarene church. And of course, at this point, not only are we in a new country, new culture, but we're now in this shelter, we're in a different town, I'm changing schools. And we say, okay, reluctantly, we had the idea of the Catholic Church or Catholicism in Colombia, and we didn't want to go through those motions of just going and saying some prayers and maybe not meaning much, but we really didn't know what to expect. And so, of course, we were in a place of need, and we agreed to go. Of course, Protestantism is very different than Catholicism, the evangelical movement, and we got to meet some really kind and loving people in this church. And it was here where I really saw, now that I look back, I realized what being God's hands and feet means. Here in this church, even though we of course look like none of them, and everybody has their strengths and weaknesses, but they definitely displayed God's love. They were God's hands and feet. They welcomed me to the youth group, so I got to befriend over time some of the teenagers at that point that became my friends. Some of the families put money together to buy my mom a car. Some people would drive me to school every now and then. And so, of course, this was very different than growing up in Catholicism in Colombia. And I'm not speaking badly about Catholicism, okay? It was just my experience in Colombia. But then it became clear that they were trying to encourage a relationship with Christ, which was very different. And this was reflected in how they treated me, how they treated others, strangers, loved ones. And that, of course, became very apparent to us and became very attractive to us. The youth pastor spent many weeks with me doing discipleship meetings where we would meet for 20 minutes, answer questions. I would ask questions. They would answer them, of course. And this is my beginning of starting to know Christ. And it was also the beginning of some lifelong relationships and friendships that I've had. I mean, I've not kept up with some of those friendships, but certainly there's still friendships that I have. And at the same time, there's this woman, Sheila, also became a mentor, both for my mom and I. So during that time, because I grew spiritually there at that church, I ended up choosing to go to an undergrad school, which was a Christian school, also a Nazarene school. And it's interesting because a lot of people that go to this school are many times forced by their parents. Let's say that they go to church and like you have to go to this Christian school. So many people would have they'll be jaded by that point. Like, I don't want to be here, all this this stuff. For me, it was a new stage in my spiritual life, so I really looked forward to those 4 years, and I really took advantage of being at that Christian school, going to chapel and doing the studies and all of that stuff. So I grew spiritually there, and I grew in knowing Christ, in developing that relationship with Christ, and that was really powerful. So got lost in my thought there, I'm sorry. So that is how I came to know Christ, and that's how I'm still growing to know him. And one question that Ryan asked us to reflect as we share our testimony is, of course, how does life, or how has life changed from before we knew Christ to after we know Christ? And as my story kind of displays a little bit, there was a lot of uncertainty, there wasn't a lot of guidance, there was not a lot of support in my early childhood days. And one thing that has been certain is after I have given my life to Christ is that I found a lot of certainty, and certainty does not mean that of course we know it all, or that we know what's going to happen, but certainty is in his faithfulness, knowing that we can trust him, knowing that even when we don't know what tomorrow will bring, that he will provide. And so with that guidance, support, and certainty, my life has certainly changed a great deal. 3 specific examples, too, of his faithfulness that I would like to share during this time have to do with, I've learned through the years that the best predictor of the future is what's happened in the past, right? And so many people often, whether they're believers or not, they always think like, well, how do you know God had his hand in this? How did he not have his hand in this? Could it be just coincidence, And there have been many circumstances, but there have been 3 specific ones that I really attribute to God, to his presence. And because of that, I continue to, glorify him. One is, during those times when we were in the shelter, we had to do quarterly visits with immigration. So we were based in Ohio, in Columbus, Ohio. We would drive 2.5 hours to Cleveland. That's where the immigration office was. And they would just check to make sure that the relationship was fine between my mom and this person. But of course, after this, the abuse in the relationship occurred, we had to change the routine. Well, one time we went to immigration. It was my mom, my brother, and I. And there was something missing in the file. We usually have to bring some sort of affidavit, sign it, bring a check, and then you turn it in, and then you kind of are on to the next quarter. Well, there was something missing either in the affidavit or there was something different. And this woman just looked at us very strangely and said, well, you have the wrong form, or this shouldn't apply right now. And for us, again, new culture, we were just here probably a year and a half. We realized, based on this person's face, that something was not right. So she goes out of the room. I think she talks to a supervisor. She comes in. Essentially, they could have deported us right there and there because of the documents that we had or didn't have. For some reason, this woman fighting in her heart, which is unusual in an immigration office, to say, look, you need to leave. You need to go find the right form, bring it back next week with a new check. Of course, we do that, in hindsight. We could have been on a plane that afternoon back to Colombia with nothing to go back to. So that's one example of God's faithfulness. A second example is, when Erin and I met in grad school, we got married. She has her PhD, I'm a physician, and so for training, it's really difficult to choose where you go. You essentially make a list of things, and then whoever chooses you, that's where you go. So you don't really have a great chance of choosing, right? And so when you choose somebody who's going into a medical fellowship and a PhD, postdoctorate, it's even harder. It's like, you're multiplying your chances, tremendously. But we knew that God would be faithful, and we needed to be in Ohio. We wanted to be in a specific location, and there was also a time limit to where I think Erin had to put her list, and within a few days, I had to put mine. And so it depended on where she would get matched, and then that's how we rank my list. Well, needless to say, God came through. We ended up in the same area, within a 2-hour, driving location, so that when we got married, we were able to stay together. We didn't want to have a long-term relationship. So God came through at that point too. And then a third time was after I finished my training, I found the job that I wanted out of fellowship back in Ohio. And Erin followed me, in her training because we thought she would find a good position after that. And so a year came by, I was happy in my job, but Erin did not find a job. And so it came the conversation, which was difficult, about, well, do we look kind of all over the country and move again, which would mean me, at that point, really the breadwinner, leaving my job behind for kind of an uncertainty, in a way. And it was interesting because I was talking to a couple of my professional mentors who were older than me. I mean, I was probably 30 at the point, and maybe they were in their 50s. And they're like, this is ridiculous. Why would you ever leave a stable job? They were, of course, kind of my bosses and colleagues. They were like, why would you leave our situation to follow your wife? She doesn't even have a job yet. And so, it was a lot of pressure. It was, essentially, think about your professional mentor saying, you are making a stupid decision. Don't do it. And so, we prayed about it, and it was a really hard decision. We decided to leave that job and search for a job throughout the States. We ended up here in Maryland, in the job that she has right now at Towson. And I am extremely happy with the job that I found afterwards. I think God was so faithful in just in the way that He provided for us. So those are just 3 examples. I think that, when we look at our past, hopefully you guys will be able to see places and circumstances where God has been faithful, so that when we move forward, look into the future, we can lean in His faithfulness because it is present, it is real, it is tangible, and that's why we're here. That's why we're here to glorify Him. So thank you for your time. Glory to God.